It's time for another good idea, bad idea. Bad idea.
Japanese troops leave for the conquest of Manchuria. Japan, the first of this war's aggressor nations, starting out a full 14 years ago on a career of international conquest and pillage.
Bad idea.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
Bad idea.
The Japanese invasion of the Philippines was conducted on schedule. The first landing was made on December 8th. And during the 2 weeks following, beachheads were successfully secured at 6 points in the archipelago.
Good idea.
So this will be video 1 in a 5-video series that I am extremely excited for. In partnership with World of Warships, over the next few months I'm going to be covering the naval war in the Pacific, all the way from Pearl Harbor to the final surrender. For anybody who doesn't know, World of Warships is an online free-to-play naval combat simulator, where you can take command of ships that define naval combat in the 20th century, including some, actually pretty much all, of the ships that will be discussed in the series, along with over 200 other historical battleships, all designed from 3D scans of their real-life counterparts. The game is a great balance of strategy and action. I myself have been especially enjoying playing aircraft carriers, as they had a whole new dimension to the game. Something new to me that they've added is changing the mechanics of how planes from aircraft carriers are controlled. And I'm not gonna lie, I wasted a lot of video making time playing with this new mechanic. It's really awesome. Surprise the American fleet in a questionable first strike commanding the Kaga, or get payback for that questionable first strike in the West Virginia, or follow the series by playing the ships discussed while we move through all major points of the war. New players will receive 1 million credits, 250 doubloons, a Hosho aircraft carrier, and 3 days of premium time by using my code. Just use the code Potential History Ships of War when signing up and begin sailing today. So you've probably seen some iteration of this meme before, of the Axis powers early in World War II winning victory after victory, and then Japan screwing it all up by attacking the US fleet at Pearl Harbor, and bringing the United States into World War II as a huge game changer, thwarting all hopes of an Axis victory. And while there are a lot of incorrect things to unpack in that sentence that are outside of the scope of this video, the attack on Pearl Harbor is often boiled down to something that simple.
Say that there is at least a chance that I didn't think this through completely.
Just a big, dumb mistake with very little thought put into why. And given the outcome, I understand why it's presented that way. But to understand the war in the Pacific and the Japanese as a whole, something I plan to dedicate a lot of time to in this series, you need to understand the reasons that they started it and why these two countries came into conflict in the first place. The Second World War is obviously the lowest point for American-Japanese relations, but to see how it got to that point, you really need to see how they were before that. And in short, they were never great. In the 1850s, the relationship started off on poor ground when Commodore Perry forced the isolated nation of Japan to open up its port to the world.
Knock knock, it's the United States.
Much to the chagrin of many Japanese living in a society still basically in the Middle Ages, who didn't really possess the technology to do anything about it with the American ship's guns trained on them.
Hey, you gonna open up the country or what?
Japan, quickly taking this lesson to heart, modernized, at the fastest pace any nation ever has, defeating the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War only 50 years later. It was at the end of this war the second blow to the two nations' relationship came, as American President Theodore Roosevelt, who presided over the peace talks, did not believe that the Russians had to pay war reparations, angering the Japanese people, resulting in anti-American riots, which resulted in anti-Japanese activity in the United States. After World War I, Japan again felt mistreated by the US due to the London naval treaties limiting the size and numbers of their warships right as they were becoming a major player, wanting to spread their influence to neighboring territories. After breaking from the treaty, feeling it was unfair, the Japanese began spreading said influence, with public outcry from the United States denouncing it. Ignoring this, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, and then China proper in 1937. By 1941, though, the Japanese had learned one of the facts of life the hard way: that China is big, and by comparison, Japan is small. And although they were winning victories, the invasion force had gotten bogged down, with the Chinese Nationalist Army becoming more and more competent after just about everyone had sent advisors there, with the most recent ones being the United States also sending material. The Japanese also took parts of Indochina in a half-invasion, half-deal with France as one of the perks of the Axis Pact, but to do all of this, the Japanese had been heavily reliant on foreign imports for war-making, most importantly oil imports from the United States, that were completely stopped after the invasion of Indochina when the US froze their assets, completely stopping trade, severely hindering their war-making ability. And this sends panic through the Japanese military, leaving them with only a couple of options to really rectify it, none of which were very good. The first was to give in to the US's demands, i.e. leave China, which was a complete non-starter in the ranks of the high command, as too much cost had been sunk in and it would be viewed as a defeat or surrender, something, as I'm sure you know, the Japanese were not into. The second was a strike to the north into the Soviet Union assisting Germany, but after Nomonhan that move was seen as less than ideal. The third option was called Nanshi-Ro, or the Southern Expansion Doctrine, which would be an advance into Southeast Asia, including the Philippines and beyond, to capture the resources there and bring them into the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. You have no idea how many times it took me to say that. To fuel the empire. And I'm sure at least a few of you have been waiting for me to mention that, as it was Japan's rationale for its expansionist policy, and it is actually really interesting but isn't entirely in the scope of this series. But you should go look it up. The problem with this was it would involve invading English, American, and Dutch colonies, which the Japanese kind of viewed as one force, and beginning war with them. So basically, to continue the war with large power China, they had to secure resources for it by beginning war with large power United States. And this is where people see the fault in this plan, and wonder how they thought it could have ever worked. The thing is, the Japanese never really thought it would work, at least in the way that it turned out. In the Imperial Conference of November 5th, 1941, which I have a link to the transcript of in the description, all the big names of the Empire of Japan being present discuss how a diplomatic option is not going to work, but how risky the military option is. They were fully aware of the power of the United States, and that an attack on them provoking an all-out war would be suicidal, just as most people see it today. But that actually wasn't the plan. The Japanese saw the United States as a rather powerful, but I guess lazy, for lack of a better term, country. And I mean, it's kind of easy to see why. The war had been going on for various numbers of years, depending on when you start counting, against many of its strong allies, and it had done little more than vocalize its position and send guns. The Japanese had no intention of getting into a long, drawn-out war. They even state themselves that a protracted war with the United States would be a mistake, and hoped in one quick move to take the territories it held, along with dealing a swift blow to the Navy that would hopefully be bad enough to convince the United States to roll over and accept the changes, because the Japanese didn't think that they would have the stomach for a long fight. With the territories taken and the Navy recovering from losses, even if the United States wanted to fight, it would take some time for them to get back into the field, needing to repair their fleet first, giving the smaller Japanese Navy a fighting chance. This, however, was still a very large risk, and the Japanese were aware of it. In fact, every representative present at the meeting talks about how things would have to go absolutely perfectly on their prospective ends for this to be pulled off, as the entire plan would be a huge strain on the Japanese state, with Suzuki saying sustained war was not an option, Kaya saying it would only be possible with an increase in taxes and a widespread looting and exploitation of the conquered territories, Nagano saying that it rode on the initial operations, and if they weren't successful, a prolonged war could not be won, and multiple statements from Sugiyama saying that it would be possible due to the poor quality of troops in the areas to be attacked, but stating once again that the war must be short. Further going on to encourage the move being made soon, as the longer they waited, the more defenses could be prepared in the areas they were planning on striking in. And although very nervous about it, this is the plan they went with. And on December 7th, 1941, a date
which will live in infamy, the United States of America suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
And unlike the rest of the battles in this series, I'm not going to talk about this because it's been absolutely done to death. I think the motivation as to why it happened is a little more interesting. That basically, the Japanese picked the best scenario out of multiple bad or impossible ones to not lose their sunk cost in China.
You don't have a better bad idea than this?
This is the best bad idea we have, sir.
Starting off the greatest naval war that humanity has ever seen that we'll be covering in further episodes. Before I go though, I do want to clarify one thing. What I've just covered here is oftentimes framed as the big bad United States forced Japan into war because they wouldn't trade with them, and poor Japan was left with this only option that they didn't want to go with. And although you can see it that way, it would not be correct unless Japan was doing some kind of humanitarian mission during their conquest of China. They were in fact doing far from that, and the US's objection to their rather brutal conquest of the country is extremely justified, and limiting their war-making potential was the best thing they could have done for the Japanese territories that weren't all too fond about being invaded. Thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring this ongoing series. Also thank you to my patrons, some of whose names you'll see on the screen. It's always nice to have a generous sponsor on the channel, and I am very grateful for those, but patrons are by far the solid and reliable force that is able to keep the channel going, so thank you so much to them. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you next week.